Behind the gilded gates of Ravensholm Palace, where centuries of tradition collide with modern reality, King Edward faces the most devastating choice of his reign. A secret that could shatter the very foundation of the monarchy has emerged from the shadows, forcing him to choose between his heart and his crown. As Queen Margaret stands in the moonlit corridors, tears streaming down her face in silent anguish, the kingdom sleeps, unaware that their beloved royal couple's world is crumbling. What decision could be so earth-shattering that it would leave the strongest woman in the realm broken? The answer lies buried in dusty palace archives, whispered conversations behind closed doors, and a truth so powerful it threatens to rewrite history itself. The morning mist clung to the ancient towers of Ravensholm Palace like a shroud of secrets as King Edward Alexander Montrose stood at his office window, staring out at the vast gardens that had been his sanctuary for over 3 decades of rule. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the leather-bound document that had arrived via private courier just hours earlier. The royal seal remained unbroken, yet somehow Edward knew that breaking it would change everything forever. Queen Margaret Elizabeth entered the room with her usual grace, carrying a silver tray with his morning tea. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and her kind blue eyes reflected the same warmth that had captured his heart 45 years ago when they were both young and believed that love could conquer any obstacle. She had been his rock through every crisis, every scandal, every moment when the weight of the crown threatened to crush his spirit. "You're troubled this morning, my dear," Margaret observed, setting the tray down on his mahogany desk with practiced elegance. Her voice carried the gentle concern of a woman who had spent decades reading her husband's moods like an open book. "You barely touched your breakfast, and Jenkins mentioned you were pacing the halls at dawn." Edward turned from the window, his deep brown eyes heavy with a burden he couldn't yet voice. At 72, he still carried himself with the dignified bearing of a king, but Margaret could see the cracks in his armor that no one else would ever notice. His broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of not just a kingdom, but of secrets that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. "Margaret," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion he was struggling to contain. "There are things about our past, about my past, that I've never told you. Things I thought were buried so deep they could never surface again." The Queen's hands stilled on the tea service, her intuition immediately alerting her to the gravity of the moment. In 45 years of marriage, Edward had never spoken to her with such devastating seriousness. She had weathered political storms, family scandals, and public controversies by his side, but something in his tone told her this was different. This was personal in a way that cut to the very core of who they were as a couple. "Whatever it is, Edward, we'll face it together," she said softly, moving closer to him with the grace that had made her beloved by the people. "We always have." But Edward couldn't meet her eyes as he picked up the sealed document. His fingers traced the elaborate wax seal bearing the coat of arms of the House of Ravenswood, the very family that had ruled the kingdom for 8 centuries. The irony wasn't lost on him that this document, bearing his own family seal, might be the instrument of their downfall. The truth was that 28 years ago, during a particularly difficult period in their marriage when Margaret had suffered 3 devastating miscarriages, and their relationship had grown distant and formal, Edward had made a mistake that haunted him to this very day. During a state visit to the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, he had met Lady Isabella Fairfax, a stunning diplomat with raven-black hair and eyes like emeralds. What had begun as innocent conversations about trade agreements had evolved into something deeper, more dangerous. Margaret had been dealing with her grief and solitude, following the advice of royal physicians who suggested she needed time and space to heal. Edward, feeling helpless and rejected, had found comfort in Isabella's understanding and warmth. For 3 months, their affair had burned like wildfire, conducted in secret meetings in foreign embassies and stolen moments during official functions. When Margaret finally emerged from her period of mourning, ready to rebuild their marriage, Edward had immediately ended the affair and thrown himself back into his role as a devoted husband. Isabella had returned to Astoria, and Edward had convinced himself that what happened in those dark months could remain buried forever. Margaret never knew about the affair, and their marriage had grown stronger than ever in the years that followed. But secrets have a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. The document in his hands contained a letter from Isabella, now the Dowager Duchess of Westmore, following her husband's recent death. But it wasn't just any letter. Accompanying it was a birth certificate dated exactly 9 months after their affair had ended, bearing the name of a son Edward never knew existed. Thomas Alexander Fairfax was now 27 years old, a successful architect living quietly in a capital city, completely unaware that his biological father was the king of the realm. Isabella had raised him as the son of her late husband, the Duke of Westmore, and Thomas had lived his entire life believing himself to be ducal nobility rather than royal blood. But Isabella was dying. Cancer had taken hold of her body, and, with her remaining time measured in weeks rather than months, she had made the decision to reveal the truth, not to cause pain or seek revenge, but because she believed Thomas deserved to know his real heritage before she passed away. She was asking for a meeting, one final conversation to discuss how this revelation should be handled. Edward's mind raced through the implications. If this information became public, it would create a succession crisis that could tear the kingdom apart. Thomas, as the king's eldest biological child, would technically have a stronger claim to the throne than Crown Prince William, Edward, and Margaret's adopted son who had been raised as their heir for the past 20 years. The political ramifications would be catastrophic, but even more devastating was the personal cost. Margaret, who had never been able to carry a child to term despite years of trying, had poured all her maternal love into William when they adopted him as an infant. She had never known that while she was grieving her lost pregnancies, her husband had fathered a child with another woman. The betrayal would shatter her heart and potentially destroy their marriage. "Edward, you're frightening me," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever that document contains, please just tell me." The silence is worse than any truth could be. But Edward wasn't certain of that. As he looked at his wife's trusting face, he realized that some truths were so devastating they could destroy everything good and pure in the world. Margaret had been the perfect queen, beloved by their people, gracious in every public appearance, dignified in every crisis. She had sacrificed her own happiness countless times for the good of the kingdom, and now he was faced with the possibility of destroying her world with a single revelation. The weight of his crown had never felt heavier as Edward Alexander Montrose, king of the realm, stood in his palace office and contemplated the choice between protecting his wife's heart and facing the truth that threatened to bring down everything they had built together. The sealed document lay on his desk like a ticking time bomb, and with each passing moment, the pressure of his impossible decision grew stronger. Outside, the kingdom went about its daily business, citizens living their lives in blissful ignorance of the royal crisis unfolding behind palace walls. But inside the most powerful residence in the land, a marriage built on 4 decades of love and trust was about to face its greatest test, and the future of an entire monarchy hung in the balance. The morning mist continued to swirl around the palace towers, as if nature itself was trying to hide the secrets that were about to change everything forever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Persian rugs in the royal study as Edward finally broke the wax seal with hands that shook despite his efforts to maintain royal composure. Margaret sat in the leather armchair across from his desk, her needlework abandoned in her lap as she watched her husband's face transform from confusion to shock to something approaching devastation. For 45 years, she had been able to read every expression that crossed his features, but this was different. This was the look of a man watching his world collapse. The letter from Isabella was written in elegant script on ivory paper that bore the subtle fragrance of lavender, a scent that immediately transported Edward back to those stolen afternoons in Astoria nearly 3 decades ago. Her words were careful, respectful, yet they carried the weight of a revelation that could topple kingdoms. "Your Majesty." The letter began formally, though Edward could almost hear Isabella's gentle voice speaking the words. "I write to you not from malice or desire for personal gain, but from a mother's desperate need to ensure her son knows the truth of his heritage before I am no longer able to speak for him." Thomas Alexander Fairfax was born on March 15th, exactly 9 months after our last meeting in the Embassy Gardens. He carries your eyes, your stubbornness, and your sense of justice, though he knows nothing of his true parentage. Margaret's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence like a blade, and Edward looked up to see her staring at him with wide eyes that reflected a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. She had heard enough to understand that this was about a child, about heritage, about secrets that had been kept from her for decades. "Edward," she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of pain that comes from deep betrayal. "Please tell me this isn't what I think it is." But Edward's continued reading of the letter only confirmed her worst fears. Isabella wrote about Thomas's accomplishments, his graduation from the Royal Academy of Architecture, his marriage to a lovely woman named Catherine, and his recent promotion to chief designer for the kingdom's historical preservation projects. She painted a picture of a young man who had grown up to be everything a father could hope for, yet who remained completely unaware of his royal blood. "I am dying, Edward," the letter continued. "The physicians give me perhaps 6 weeks, possibly 8 if I'm fortunate. I have spent 27 years keeping your secret, protecting your marriage, and allowing Thomas to grow up believing himself to be the son of a duke rather than a king. But I cannot take this knowledge to my grave. He deserves to know who he truly is, and you deserve the chance to know your son before I am gone forever." The word son hung in the air between the royal couple like a physical presence, heavy with implications that neither of them was fully prepared to face. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her movements careful and measured as if she was afraid that any sudden motion might shatter what remained of her world. Her face had gone pale, but her chin remained raised with the dignity that had made her beloved by their subjects. "When?" she asked quietly, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "When did this happen, Edward? When did you father another woman's child?" Edward set the letter down on his desk with infinite care, knowing that this moment would define the rest of their lives together. The truth had lived in his heart like a hidden wound for 28 years, festering in silence, growing more painful with each anniversary that passed unacknowledged. Now, as he prepared to voice it for the first time, he realized that secrets don't simply disappear when revealed. They transform into something else entirely, something that can either heal or destroy depending on how they're handled. "It was during your time of mourning," he said softly, referring to the darkest period of their marriage when Margaret had withdrawn completely after losing their 3rd pregnancy. "You had asked for space, for time to grieve alone. The physicians said it was best for your recovery. I felt helpless, rejected, lost in my own grief for the children we would never have." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she remained standing, her royal training keeping her spine straight even as her heart began to break. "So you found comfort with someone else. While I was grieving our lost babies, you were creating a new one with another woman." The accusation in her voice was like a physical blow, made all the more devastating because Edward knew it was entirely justified. He had betrayed her trust in the most fundamental way possible, and no amount of explanation could change that fact. Yet he pressed on, knowing that the complete truth, however painful, was the only path forward. "Her name is Isabella Fairfax. She was part of the Asturian diplomatic delegation during the trade negotiations. What started as professional conversations became something more during those 3 months when you and I were barely speaking. When you finally came back to me, I ended it immediately. I never saw her again, never knew about the child." "But you're certain?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "Certain that this boy is yours?" Edward picked up the second document that had accompanied Isabella's letter, a birth certificate that included details only the child's biological father would know. The timing was irrefutable, the dates aligning perfectly with their affair. More damning still was the photograph Isabella had included, showing a young man with Edward's distinctive jawline, his deep-set eyes, and the same way of carrying himself that had marked the Montrose bloodline for generations. "Thomas Alexander Fairfax," Edward said, reading the name aloud for the first time. "He's 27 years old, married, and, according to Isabella, he's been working on the restoration of the old cathedral downtown. We may have passed him on the street dozens of times without knowing." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. For decades, they had mourned their inability to have biological children, had poured their love into their adopted son William, and had accepted that their direct bloodline would end with Edward's reign. Meanwhile, his biological son had been living in their own capital city, contributing to the preservation of their kingdom's heritage, completely unaware of his connection to the crown. Margaret moved to the window where Edward had stood that morning, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light filtering through the ancient glass. The gardens below stretched out in perfect symmetry, a testament to centuries of careful planning and maintenance. Everything in their world had been ordered, controlled, maintained according to tradition and protocol. Now, a single letter threatened to upend all of that careful balance. "Isabella is dying," she said quietly, not really asking for confirmation but rather speaking the reality aloud to help herself process it. "And she wants to tell him the truth before she's gone." She's asking for a meeting, Edward confirmed. She wants to discuss how this should be handled, what Thomas should be told, how we might manage the situation without destroying the kingdom or our family. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly working through the implications. As queen, she understood better than almost anyone how a revelation like this could affect the monarchy. Their son William, now 26 and preparing to take on more royal responsibilities as heir apparent, would suddenly find his position threatened by an older half-brother with a stronger claim to the throne. The political chaos could destabilize the government, divide the noble families who had sworn allegiance to William, and potentially lead to a constitutional crisis that could tear the kingdom apart. But, as a woman, as a wife who had just learned that her husband had betrayed her during the darkest period of her life, Margaret was dealing with pain that went far beyond political concerns. The knowledge that while she was grieving their lost children, Edward had been creating new life with another woman was like salt in wounds that had never fully healed. The timing made it exponentially worse, turning what might have been a survivable betrayal into something that felt deliberately cruel. "Do you want to meet him?" she asked finally, her voice so quiet it was barely audible. "Your son." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 decades of regret settling on his shoulders like lead. Of course he wanted to meet Thomas. From the moment he had seen the photograph, he had felt a pull toward this young man who carried his blood, his features, his genes. The paternal instinct that had never had a proper outlet during his marriage had awakened with fierce intensity. But wanting something and being able to act on it were two entirely different things, especially when that action could destroy everything else he held dear. "I don't know if wanting it matters," he said honestly. "This isn't about what I want, Margaret. This is about what's right, what's best for everyone involved." Thomas has lived his entire life believing himself to be someone else. William has grown up expecting to inherit the throne. You've built your identity around being queen and mother to our adopted son. Isabella is dying and wants closure before she's gone. There's no solution here that doesn't hurt someone. Margaret turned from the window to face him, and Edward saw something in her expression that he had never seen before in 4 decades of marriage. It wasn't anger, though there was certainly pain. It wasn't even betrayal, though that was clearly present as well. It was something deeper, more complex. It was the look of a woman realizing that the foundation of her entire adult life had been built on incomplete information, and that now she had to decide what to do with the truth. "I need time," she said simply. "Time to process this, to think about what it means for all of us. But, Edward, you need to understand something. This changes everything. Not just politically, not just for the succession, but for us. For our marriage. I don't know if I can forgive this, and I don't know if I can live with the knowledge that somewhere out there is your son while I remain childless." As Margaret left the study, her footsteps echoing in the marble corridors of the palace, Edward remained alone with Isabella's letter and the photograph of a young man he had never met but who carried his bloodline. The afternoon shadows grew longer, and somewhere in the capital city, Thomas Alexander Fairfax went about his daily life, unaware that his existence was about to transform the very fabric of the kingdom he called home. The palace, which had witnessed 8 centuries of royal secrets, held its breath as one more devastating truth settled into its ancient walls, waiting to see whether this revelation would strengthen the monarchy or destroy it entirely. The clock tower of Ravensholm Palace chimed midnight as Queen Margaret Elizabeth wandered the moonlit corridors like a ghost haunting her own life. Sleep had become impossible since Edward's revelation 3 days earlier, and the palace that had been her sanctuary for 4 decades now felt like a prison of memories and broken dreams. Each portrait of past queens that lined the walls seemed to judge her, their painted eyes following her restless journey through rooms that held decades of carefully constructed happiness. She paused before the portrait of Queen Victoria Montrose, Edward's great-grandmother, who had ruled alongside her husband during the kingdom's golden age of expansion and prosperity. Victoria had been known for her fierce devotion to family, her unwavering moral standards, and her ability to weather any political storm through sheer force of will. Margaret had always strived to live up to that legacy, to be worthy of the crown that had been placed upon her head with such ceremony and hope all those years ago. Now, staring at Victoria's serene painted expression, Margaret wondered what the great queen would have done if faced with the revelation that her beloved husband had fathered a secret child during the darkest period of their marriage. Would she have found the strength to forgive? Would she have prioritized the stability of the kingdom over her own wounded heart? Or would she have made the choices that seemed increasingly attractive to Margaret as each sleepless hour passed? The sound of footsteps on marble drew Margaret from her troubled contemplation, and she turned to see Lady Catherine Pemberton, her longtime lady-in-waiting and closest confidant, approaching with a worried expression. Catherine had served the royal family for over 30 years and possessed the rare combination of absolute discretion and genuine affection that made her invaluable during times of crisis. "Your Majesty," Catherine said softly, her voice carrying the gentle concern of a woman who had watched over Margaret through countless trials. "Jenkins mentioned that you've been walking the halls again tonight. Perhaps some warm milk or chamomile tea might help you rest." Margaret managed a weak smile, appreciating Catherine's tactful way of expressing concern without overstepping boundaries. In the complex hierarchy of palace life, their relationship occupied a unique space between servant and friend, professional and personal. Catherine was one of the few people who could speak to the Queen with genuine intimacy while maintaining the respect that protocol demanded. "Sleep seems to be avoiding me lately, Catherine," Margaret replied, settling onto an antique settee beneath a window that looked out over the palace gardens. The moonlight streaming through the glass created intricate patterns on the floor, and Margaret found herself thinking about how light and shadow could transform the appearance of even the most familiar objects. "I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my life." Catherine settled into a nearby chair, her keen gray eyes studying the Queen's face with the expertise of someone who had learned to read royal moods over decades of service. She had noticed the tension in the palace over the past few days, the hushed conversations between the King and Queen, the way they seemed to be orbiting each other without truly connecting. Something significant had happened, and Catherine's loyalty demanded that she be available to help in whatever way she could. "Sometimes when our world shifts unexpectedly, it helps to talk about it with someone who cares about our well-being," Catherine offered carefully. "I've served this family long enough to know that even the strongest marriages face challenges that test their foundations." Margaret considered her options. The urge to confide in someone, to share the burden of knowledge that had been crushing her spirit for 3 days, was almost overwhelming. Catherine had kept royal secrets for 3 decades without ever betraying a confidence. She had been present during some of the most difficult moments of Margaret's reign, including the devastating miscarriages that had shaped so much of her relationship with Edward. If anyone could be trusted with this latest crisis, it would be Catherine. "If I were to tell you something that could change how you view the royal family, something that might challenge your loyalty to the crown, would you want to hear it?" Margaret asked, her voice heavy with the weight of her dilemma. "Your Majesty, my loyalty has never been to an institution or a title," Catherine replied without hesitation. "It has been to you, personally, for 30 years. Whatever burden you're carrying, sharing it won't diminish my respect or devotion. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is admit we need support." Taking a deep breath that felt like it might be her last as the woman she had been for 70 years, Margaret began to tell Catherine about Isabella's letter, about Edward's confession, about the son who carried royal blood while living as a duke's child in ignorance of his true heritage. As the story unfolded, she watched Catherine's expression shift from surprise to understanding to something approaching protective anger on Margaret's behalf. 28 years, Catherine said quietly when Margaret finished speaking. "He's kept this secret for 28 years while watching you mourn the children you couldn't carry." The statement hung in the air between them, stark and unforgiving in its simplicity. It captured the cruel irony of the situation in a way that made Margaret's chest tighten with fresh pain. All those years of medical consultations, of hoping for pregnancy announcements that never came, of feeling like she had failed in her most basic duty as a wife and queen. Meanwhile, Edward's son had been growing up just miles away, carrying the royal bloodline that she had been unable to provide. "The worst part," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly, "is that I understand why he did it. I had withdrawn completely after the 3rd miscarriage. I was so lost in my own grief that I pushed him away for months. I told him I needed space, needed time, needed to be alone with my pain. He was grieving too, but I was too selfish to see it." "Your grief doesn't excuse his betrayal," Catherine said firmly, her usual diplomatic demeanor giving way to protective instinct. "You were dealing with an unimaginable loss, and he chose to seek comfort in another woman's bed rather than fight for his marriage. That choice created a child while you were mourning the children you had lost. There is no justification for the timing, no matter how difficult things were between you." Margaret absorbed Catherine's words, recognizing the truth in them while struggling with the complexity of her emotions. Part of her wanted to hold onto the anger, to use it as armor against the devastating pain of betrayal. But another part of her, the part that had loved Edward for over 4 decades, understood that people make terrible choices when they're drowning in their own pain and confusion. "Catherine, what would you do?" Margaret asked desperately. "If this were your marriage, your family, your entire life's work at stake, what choice would you make?" The older woman was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she considered the impossible situation. Finally, she spoke with the wisdom that comes from decades of observing human nature in all its complexity. "I think you have 3 choices, Your Majesty. You can forgive and work to rebuild your marriage while finding a way to acknowledge this young man without destroying Prince William's future. You can separate from the king quietly while maintaining the appearance of unity for the sake of the kingdom. Or you can choose to prioritize your own healing above all other considerations, regardless of the political consequences." Margaret nodded slowly, recognizing that Catherine had articulated the options that had been swirling in her mind for 3 sleepless days. Each path carried enormous risks and painful sacrifices. Forgiveness would require her to swallow her hurt and accept a fundamental change in how she viewed her marriage. Separation would mean living a lie for the rest of her life, maintaining public appearances while grieving privately. And prioritizing her own healing might mean walking away from everything she had built as queen, potentially destabilizing the monarchy during a crucial period of transition. "There's something else," Margaret said quietly. "Isabella is dying. She wants to meet with Edward to discuss how to tell Thomas the truth before she's gone. Part of me thinks she deserves that closure, that this young man deserves to know who he really is. But another part of me wants to deny her that peace, to let her take this secret to her grave as punishment for the pain she's caused." Catherine's expression softened with understanding. "Those feelings don't make you a bad person, Your Majesty. They make you human. But ultimately, this decision isn't about Isabella or even about Thomas. It's about what kind of person you want to be when you're facing the end of your own life. What choice will let you live with yourself for whatever years remain?" As dawn approached, and the first hints of sunlight began to creep through the palace windows, Margaret realized that Catherine was right. This crisis wasn't just about forgiveness or politics or royal succession. It was about defining who she truly was beneath the crown, beyond the title, at the core of her being. Was she a woman capable of grace in the face of devastating betrayal? Was she strong enough to prioritize the greater good over her own wounded heart? Or was she human enough to choose her own healing, even if it meant watching her carefully constructed world crumble around her? The morning would bring new challenges, new conversations with Edward, new decisions that would affect not just their marriage, but the future of an entire kingdom. But, for now, in the quiet moments before dawn, Margaret Elizabeth Montrose sat in contemplation, preparing to discover who she truly was when everything she thought she knew about herself was stripped away. The palace clock chimed 5 times, and, somewhere in the capital city, Thomas Alexander Fairfax slept peacefully beside his wife, unaware that his existence had set in motion events that would transform the very foundations of the realm he called home. The private airfield outside the capital hummed with activity as dawn broke over the kingdom's rolling countryside. King Edward stood beside the royal helicopter, his formal military dress replaced by a simple dark suit that would attract less attention during what was meant to be a completely secret meeting. The decision to meet Isabella had been made the previous evening after another sleepless night of agonizing contemplation. And now, as the aircraft prepared for departure, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him like a physical force. Margaret had not come to see him off. Their conversation the night before had been civil but distant, marked by the kind of careful politeness that had characterized the worst periods of their marriage decades earlier. She had given her consent for the meeting with Isabella, understanding that some form of closure was necessary for all involved. But her agreement had come with conditions that made Edward's heart ache with their implications. "This meeting doesn't commit us to anything," she had said, her voice carefully controlled as they sat in their private sitting room surrounded by photos of happier times. "You can hear what she has to say, you can see your son if that's what you need, but I won't be forced into any decisions about succession or acknowledgement or public revelation until I've had time to process all of this completely." The flight to Astoria took 2 hours, giving Edward plenty of time to rehearse conversations that no amount of royal training had prepared him for. How do you speak to a woman you once loved, but haven't seen in nearly 3 decades? How do you meet a son who doesn't know you exist? How do you navigate the complex emotions of paternal longing while respecting the life that child has built without you? Isabella had chosen to meet at her private estate rather than in any official capacity, recognizing that this conversation needed to happen away from diplomatic protocols and political pressures. The Fairfax family estate sat on a hillside overlooking the Asturian countryside, its elegant Georgian architecture surrounded by gardens that rivaled those at Ravensholm Palace. As Edward's unmarked car approached the main house, he caught sight of Isabella waiting on the front steps, and the years seemed to collapse around him. At 58, Isabella Fairfax retained much of the ethereal beauty that had captivated him so completely during those dark months of his marriage. Her raven hair had silver threads now, and her face showed the marks of illness and pain, but her green eyes still held the intelligence and warmth that had drawn him to her when they were both younger and more foolish. She wore a simple blue dress that emphasized her remaining elegance while acknowledging the physical toll of her battle with cancer. "Edward," she said simply as he approached, her voice carrying the same melodic quality he remembered from their stolen conversations in embassy gardens and quiet diplomatic receptions. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be incredibly difficult for you." They settled in her private study, a room lined with books and paintings that spoke of a life lived with purpose and meaning beyond their brief affair. Isabella poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, and Edward found himself studying her face for traces of the young diplomat who had offered him comfort during the darkest period of his marriage. "You look well," she said softly, though they both knew it was a polite fiction. Edward's face showed the strain of recent days, the weight of decisions that could reshape his kingdom and destroy his family. "How is Margaret taking the news?" The question was asked with genuine concern rather than jealousy, and Edward recognized the maturity that had allowed Isabella to keep his secret for nearly 3 decades without seeking personal gain or revenge. She had loved him once, but she had also respected his choice to return to his marriage and his responsibilities. That respect had extended to raising their son without bitterness or attempts to claim royal acknowledgement. "She's devastated," Edward answered honestly. "The betrayal is bad enough, but the timing makes it exponentially worse. She was grieving our lost children when Thomas was conceived, and learning that I was creating new life while she mourned as shattered something fundamental in her trust." Isabella nodded slowly, her expression reflecting genuine regret for the pain her revelation had caused. "I've struggled with this decision for months, Edward. Part of me wanted to take this secret to my grave, to let Thomas continue living as he always has, to preserve your marriage and your family's peace. But he deserves to know the truth about himself, and you deserve the chance to know him while there's still time. Tell me about him," Edward said quietly, leaning forward with the eagerness of a father finally allowed to learn about his child. "What kind of man has he become?" Isabella's face lit up with maternal pride, and for the first time since his arrival, Edward saw glimpses of the vibrant woman he had once known. "He's everything you could hope for in a son, Edward. Brilliant, principled, creative, kind to his core. He graduated top of his class from the Royal Academy of Architecture and has dedicated his career to preserving the kingdom's historical heritage. He's working on the cathedral restoration project downtown, and his designs have won international recognition for their respect for traditional craftsmanship while incorporating modern safety standards." She moved to her desk and retrieved a portfolio filled with photographs spanning Thomas's life from childhood to the present. Edward found himself staring at images that showed his own features reflected in a younger face, watching his son grow from a serious little boy to an accomplished young man without ever knowing of his existence. "He married Catherine Whitmore 3 years ago," Isabella continued, pointing to wedding photos that showed Thomas beaming beside a lovely blonde woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "She's a teacher at the local grammar school, and they're expecting their first child in the spring. Your grandchild, Edward." The revelation hit Edward like a physical blow. Not only did he have a son he had never known, but that son was about to make him a grandfather. Somewhere in the capital city, a young woman was carrying his grandchild, completely unaware that her baby would carry royal blood. The implications for succession, for the future of the monarchy, multiplied exponentially with this knowledge. "Does he know anything about his parentage?" Edward asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Does he suspect that the Duke wasn't his biological father?" Isabella shook her head. "Charles Fairfax was a good man who accepted Thomas as his own from the moment of his birth. He never treated him differently than his other children, never gave him reason to question his paternity. Thomas believes himself to be fully ducal, with no awareness of his royal blood. They were interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway, and Isabella's face brightened with anticipation and nervousness. "I asked Thomas to join us for lunch," she explained, seeing Edward's expression of shock and panic. "I haven't told him who you really are, just that you're an old friend who wanted to meet him. I thought perhaps it would be easier to see him in person before deciding how much to reveal." Edward's heart began racing as footsteps approached the study door. In moments, he would come face to face with the son he had never known existed, the young man whose very existence threatened to upend everything he had built as king and father. The irony wasn't lost on him that this meeting was taking place while Margaret sat alone in Ravensholm Palace, dealing with her own anguish over their shared tragedy. The door opened, and Thomas Alexander Fairfax entered the room with the confident stride of a man comfortable in his own skin. At 27, he was tall and lean like Edward had been at that age, with the same deep-set brown eyes and strong jawline that marked the Montrose bloodline. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from the wind, and his architect's hands showed the calluses that came from working with both design tools and actual construction materials. "Mother," he said warmly, moving to kiss Isabella's cheek with the obvious affection of a devoted son. "You look tired today. Are you certain you're feeling up to entertaining guests?" "I'm fine, darling," Isabella assured him, though Edward could see the emotional toll this meeting was taking on her weakened constitution. "Thomas, I'd like you to meet Edward Montgomery. He's an old friend from my diplomatic days, and he expressed interest in your work on the cathedral restoration." Edward rose slowly, extending his hand to shake with the son he was meeting for the first time while using a false name to hide his true identity. Thomas's grip was firm and confident, his smile genuine and warm in a way that reminded Edward painfully of Margaret during the early days of their marriage. This was his child, his blood, his legacy walking and breathing and completely unaware of their connection. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," Thomas said with the easy courtesy of a man raised among nobility. "Mother mentioned you were interested in historical preservation work. Are you involved in similar projects?" "You could say that," Edward replied carefully, his voice thick with emotions he was struggling to control. "I have a deep appreciation for maintaining our kingdom's architectural heritage for future generations." As they settled into conversation about Thomas's work, Edward found himself marveling at the young man's passion, intelligence, and obvious dedication to excellence. This was his son, and despite the circumstances of his conception and the secrecy surrounding his upbringing, Thomas had grown into exactly the kind of person any father would be proud to claim. The tragic irony was that claiming him now would destroy multiple lives and potentially topple a government. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, filled with conversations that would determine whether this secret remained buried forever or became the catalyst for changes that would reshape the very foundations of the kingdom they all called home. The great library at Ravensholm Palace had never felt more like a sanctuary than it did on this gray October afternoon, 3 weeks after Edward's secret meeting with Isabella and Thomas. Queen Margaret sat among the ancient volumes that chronicled 8 centuries of royal history, searching through the leather-bound records for precedents that might guide her through the most difficult decision of her life. The weight of knowledge pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden as she read account after account of royal scandals, succession crises, and marriages that had weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser unions. Edward had returned from Astoria fundamentally changed by his encounter with his son. The meeting had been everything he had hoped for and everything he had feared, confirming that Thomas was indeed a remarkable young man, while simultaneously making the moral complexity of their situation exponentially more difficult. Now, as autumn settled over the kingdom, and Isabella's condition continued to deteriorate according to the discreet medical reports Edward received weekly, the pressure to make a final decision had become overwhelming. Margaret looked up from a particularly relevant account of King Frederick IV's illegitimate children to find Edward standing in the library doorway. His appearance shocked her, despite having seen him every day for the past 3 weeks. The man who had always carried himself with regal bearing now seemed diminished somehow, aged beyond his 72 years by the weight of impossible choices. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his normally bright eyes dulled by sleepless nights and endless contemplation. "I've been looking for you," he said softly, approaching her reading table with the careful movements of a man walking on unstable ground. "Catherine mentioned you'd been spending considerable time here lately." Margaret gestured to the books scattered around her, centuries of royal records that told stories of triumph and tragedy, of choices made and prices paid. I've been researching precedents, she said simply, looking for examples of how previous monarchs handled situations like ours. Edward settled into the chair across from her, noting the particular volume she had been reading. The chronicles of King Frederick IV's reign were particularly relevant to their situation, as that monarch had acknowledged several illegitimate children while maintaining his marriage and keeping his legitimate heir's succession intact. However, Frederick's queen had died young, never having to live with the knowledge of her husband's betrayals, and the political landscape of 3 centuries ago bore little resemblance to the constitutional monarchy they now governed. "What have you found?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew that historical precedents would offer little comfort for their unique circumstances. "Nothing that provides a clear path forward," Margaret admitted, closing the heavy book with a sound that echoed through the library's vast space. "Every situation is different. Every choice comes with its own consequences. But, Edward, I've come to some conclusions about what we need to do." Edward leaned forward, his entire body tense with anticipation. For 3 weeks, Margaret had been processing the revelation of Thomas's existence while maintaining her public duties as queen. She had attended state dinners, received foreign ambassadors, and presided over charity events with the same grace and dignity that had marked her entire reign, even as her private world crumbled around her. Now, finally, she was ready to articulate her decision. "I want to meet him," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of careful consideration and painful acceptance. "Your son. I want to meet Thomas before Isabella dies, before any public revelations are made, before we commit to any course of action that can't be undone." Edward's face showed his surprise at her request. Of all the possible responses he had anticipated, this was perhaps the least expected. "Margaret, you don't have to put yourself through that. Meeting him will only make everything more complicated, more painful. More painful than wondering for the rest of my life what kind of man carries my husband's blood while I remain childless." Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "More complicated than making decisions about his future without knowing who he really is as a person? Edward, if we're going to acknowledge him in any way, if we're going to tell him the truth about his parentage, if we're going to integrate him into our family somehow, I need to see him myself." Margaret's decision reflected the practical wisdom that had made her an effective queen for 4 decades. She understood that emotional responses, however justified, could not be allowed to drive decisions that would affect millions of people. If Thomas was going to become part of their lives, if his existence was going to reshape the royal family's future, she needed to evaluate him herself rather than rely solely on Edward's understandably biased assessment or Isabella's maternal pride. "There's something else," Margaret continued, her hands folded carefully in her lap in the posture that had become second nature through decades of public appearances. "I've been thinking about William, about how this revelation will affect him. He's spent his entire life preparing to inherit the throne, believing himself to be our only child and heir. Learning that he has an older brother with a stronger claim to the crown will devastate him, regardless of how we handle the legal aspects of succession." Edward nodded slowly, recognizing another dimension of their crisis that had been weighing heavily on his conscience. Prince William had been adopted as an infant and raised with every advantage the royal family could provide. He had received the finest education, the most comprehensive preparation for kingship, and the complete devotion of parents who had poured all their unfulfilled parental love into making him worthy of the crown he would inherit. The revelation that his father's biological son existed and had prior claim to the throne would shatter William's sense of identity and purpose just as surely as it had shattered Margaret's trust in their marriage. "We could maintain the current succession," Edward suggested carefully. "Thomas was born outside marriage, raised by another family, and has no knowledge of his royal blood. Legally, William's claim as our designated heir would take precedence over Thomas's biological connection. We could acknowledge Thomas privately, perhaps bring him into the family gradually, without affecting the line of succession." Margaret considered this possibility, recognizing both its merits and its potential problems. "But what about Thomas's children? What about the child he's expecting with Catherine? If we acknowledge his royal blood, even privately, we're creating a secondary line of succession that could challenge our descendants for generations. And if we don't acknowledge him, if we keep this secret forever, we're condemning our grandchildren to lives built on incomplete knowledge of their heritage." The complexity of their situation seemed to multiply with each consideration. Every potential solution created new problems. Every attempt to protect one family member threatened harm to another. Margaret had spent 3 weeks examining the issue from every possible angle, and she had reached a startling conclusion about what needed to happen next. "I think we need to tell them both," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect from world leaders for decades. "William deserves to know he has a brother, and Thomas deserves to know who his father really is. We can manage the political implications. We can work with Parliament to clarify the succession without creating a constitutional crisis. But we cannot continue building our family's future on foundations of secrecy and deception." Edward stared at his wife, seeing in her face the same strength that had attracted him 45 years ago, the same moral clarity that had made her beloved by their people even during the most difficult periods of their reign. Margaret was proposing the most dangerous course of action possible, the path that carried the greatest risk of destroying everything they had built together. But she was also proposing the only solution that honored the dignity and worth of every person involved. "Isabella is dying," Edward said quietly, acknowledging the time pressure that made their decision urgent. "The physicians think she has perhaps 2 weeks remaining. If we're going to do this, if we're going to tell Thomas the truth and bring him into our family somehow, it needs to happen while his mother can be part of the conversation." Margaret nodded, her decision made and her path forward clear despite its obvious dangers. "Then, we invite them here, Edward. All of them. Thomas and his wife Catherine, Isabella while she's still able to travel, and William. We gather our family, all of our family, in one room, and we tell the truth. We let Thomas decide what he wants to do with the knowledge of his heritage. We let William choose how to respond to having a brother, and we face the consequences of our choices together." As they sat together in the library surrounded by centuries of royal history, Edward and Margaret prepared to write the next chapter of their dynasty's story. It would be a chapter marked by courage and vulnerability, by the acknowledgement of past mistakes, and the commitment to building a future based on truth rather than comfortable deception. The kingdom would weather this storm as it had weathered so many others, but the royal family would emerge from it fundamentally transformed, for better or worse. Outside the library windows, the first winter snow began to fall over Ravensholm Palace, covering the ancient gardens in pristine white that made everything appear fresh and new. Soon, the carefully maintained facades would give way to deeper truths, and the most powerful family in the kingdom would discover whether love and honesty were strong enough to survive the revelation of secrets that had shaped their lives for nearly 3 decades. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in weeks, both Edward and Margaret felt they were moving toward it together rather than being dragged forward by forces beyond their control. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners in truth rather than prisoners of deception, and their family would either heal or break apart based on foundations more solid than the secrets that had nearly destroyed them all.